As I mentioned, this is the ultimate guide to commercial real estate leases. And so we'll go ahead and get started and let's talk about different components, right? We're going to talk about the types of leases, understanding there's four main types of commercial leases. We're going to discuss what each one of them is and what kind of scenario or deal typically sees those types of leases. We're going to go over key terms and clauses. Clauses meaning when you're looking at the terms on a letter of intent, if the landlord sends it back to you, or you're looking at a lease agreement and there's specific verbiage and specific things that the landlord is asking of the tenant, these are clauses that you need to look out for because it could be detrimental to your tenant down the line and vice versa. So we're going to go over key terms and clauses. We're going to go over negotiation strategies. What is it that you need to have in your arsenal in order to be able to have leverage to negotiate a commercial lease? And that's going to be kind of sprinkled throughout the presentation. And then we're going to have just an open forum for questions and answers, anything that might come up as we discuss commercial leases. So the four types of commercial leases are gross leases, where the landlord covers the taxes, insurance, and maintenance. It's most common in office buildings. Also, I see it in industrial, but not so much now. And it's the simplest arrangement. What is a gross lease? It means the rent is $5,000 a month. That's your rent. You don't have to cover taxes. You don't have to cover insurance. There's typically no common area maintenance. It is what it is. It's just you pay the rent. And you see this in office buildings. They offer a full service type of situation where you have a lobby. The conference room is available for you to use as long as you register for it. And it's just a baseline. This is what the rent is, and there's no fluff around what the additional rents are. And we'll get to additional rents in a little bit. Net leases, the tenant pays the base rent plus different types of expenses. There's double net and there's triple net. Triple net dominates the retail properties. This is an industrial nowadays. Triple net, as discussed before, it is taxes and insurance and the common area maintenance. And the landlord prefers this structure. Why? Because it covers their expenses, right? If you look at a residential lease, you get your rent, but the owner of the home still has to pay for the property taxes and for the insurance on the home. So there's no reimbursement for them on the residential side. However, on the commercial side, when you're looking at a triple net lease, they're getting the rent and they're getting reimbursed for taxes and insurance and the cost for the common area maintenance. So it's really the ideal type of lease that a landlord would want. So that's why it's going to be the most common type of lease that you're going to see out in the industry. When you see a price point plus triple net, just know there's an added cost to that and you need to find out what it is. Modified gross is basically a mix in between both. It's a hybrid approach to the shared expenses. It basically can be whatever the landlord needs to cover or wants to cover or has figured out. I just need to get $500 a month and that's enough for me to cover my expenses to operate the building. So you got to be very careful when you see modified gross. What does that cover? What does that include? What is the tenant's responsibility when they're in this modified growth? Because they might still have to be responsible for maintenance. They might still be responsible for some additional rent, not necessarily a full reimbursement of taxes and insurance, but maybe a portion of it. So you got to be very careful when reading into a modified gross, what exactly is included for the tenant and what is the landlord actually charging for this modified gross. Then you have your percentage lease. That's a base rent plus a percentage of revenue. Most common in shopping centers, malls, food halls. Basically what this means is if you're making money, you have to pay a percentage of your sales to the landlord. So basically the landlord's success is linked to the tenant's performance. They're going to want to get a percentage of your sales after a margin. Sometimes, depending on where you're at, it's going to be a little bit structured, a little bit different. So you've got to be very, very cautious and very detailed in how that percentage is structured because it could mean a lot of money for your tenant, especially in malls. I've seen restaurants having to pay 5% of their net sales beyond the threshold of what the base rent is. And the base rent could be $20,000 a month. And as soon as they exceed that threshold of $20,000 a month, which would be $240,000 a year, A restaurant can make that in a month. And so as soon as they cross that threshold, now they're starting to pay a percentage of their sales, and 5% is a lot. If you think about how much a restaurant is actually producing in the millions, that's a lot of money that's going to a landlord. So you got to be very careful of how that percentage lease is structured. You'll see that a lot in the outlets, the kiosks. They pay a crazy amount of rent and they pay a percentage of their sales. Sometimes the tenants don't really care because they're making that kind of money, but it's always negotiable and it's always something that you need to keep in mind when you deal with percentage leases. And I've seen tenants that have been in situations where the landlord just takes too much advantage. And once they see that they're doing really well, when they go to renew, they restructure that percentage lease to benefit the landlord, and it just gets really messy. So you got to be very careful about that. This is a question that has come up, and I just wanted to really go over what the difference is between a residential lease commission and a commercial lease commission, because it's very different. And a commercial lease, even though it doesn't seem like a lot, it could actually turn out to be a pretty decent commission compared to what a residential lease would provide. So in case you didn't know, this is how you calculate a commercial commission for a commercial lease. Let's say that the space that you're renting out or leasing out is 2,200 square feet and it's $11.50 per square foot. You never include triple net in your calculations. Your commissions will mostly always be only on the base rent. So that's why we only have the $11.50 per square foot, which comes out to about $25,300 per year. Divide that by 12, that's how much your rental is. Now, let's say that you sign a 5-year lease. What you would do is you would take that 25,000. Does everyone see my calculator, by the way?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let's say you signed a 5-year lease on this, right? It doesn't seem like a lot. It's a $2,000 a month rent. But let's say you sign 5 years on this. That's $126,500. And it's going to be a little more than that because remember, commercial leases have yearly escalations. But for the sake of just easy calculations, we're just going to say that total in base rent for the 5-year term is $126,500. And typically you're going to see 3% of that. Your commission comes out to $3,795 on a small unit that's only paying $2,000 a month of rent, which is really hard to find in this market, right? Because if you've been working commercial leases, you know that leases are twice that. If you're looking for a location that is 2,200 square feet. Whoops. So your commission on a $2,000 a month lease could be $3,795, which isn't too bad if you don't spend too much time finding the location. Now, when you start getting into larger leases, let's say you're looking at a warehouse that's 10,000 square feet and they're asking, I don't know, $25 a square foot, which is the average rate in this market. And let's say that they sign for 10 years, because when you're doing large industrial spaces that require transportation, logistics, storage, they don't want to be there for 2 years. They're going to be there to set up shop, to be able to handle the logistics and the growth of their company. So let's say that they sign for 10 years. That's a $2.5 million base rent over the course of 10 years. And you get 3% of that. So now you understand marginally how lucrative a commercial lease can be if you find the right client that's actually looking for nice terms and is okay paying $14,000, $15,000, $20,000 a month in rent, which they're out there. And if you know where to find them, and if you know exactly what it is that they need, and you can find those locations for them, they'll sign that 10-year lease, and it's a really, really good payday for you. All right, let's look at rent structure and common area maintenance. This is where there's questions about what can be negotiated and what cannot be negotiated. And so this is really how you present it to the tenant. Base rent can be negotiated always. CAM fees, depending on who the landlord is, You could put a cap on how much the CAM fees increase every year, but maintenance will change in price. They might switch vendors, and that might increase the CAM a little bit or decrease the CAM a little bit. So as long as you understand that the landlord is handling those CAM expenses properly and is documenting exactly what he's or she's paying for the common area maintenance, that covers the shared spaces like the lobbies, elevators, parking, landscaping, so you always want to make sure that you request an itemized list of everything that is included in the common area maintenance, and you want to negotiate those caps on annual increases. That shows the landlord that you're aware of what your tenant is being charged. And if they cannot produce an itemized list of what's being covered with the common area maintenance, that's a red flag. And you got to be able to understand, at least understand, where's this money going to, right? And so it's very important for you to be able to understand what's being charged and that you can negotiate the cap. You can say, look, the CAM fees cannot increase more than 2% every year. And if they're being vague on the list of items that is included, even more reason for you to cap that CAM, because you don't want them to just come next year and say, well, the CAM is being increased by 7% because I have to pay $10,000 a month in landscaping now. So you got to be very wary of how detailed and how organized the landlord is with these types of expenses. Same thing goes with the base rent. Your initial base rent on the square footage and location is always going to be what you sign on the contract. But you also got to look out for how much they're increasing the base rent every year. So typical escalations, I put 2 to 3%, but I'll be honest with you, I am about to sign a lease where they're doing 4% increases. Now, these are larger retail centers. There's a lot more expenses, but there's also a lot more units and a lot more tenants. So those costs can be kind of subdivided amongst all the units by square footage or by unit. So it's important for you to understand that these annual increases can be negotiated on capping them. But if you're dealing with a large property management company, they usually have those standardized, and they're not going to budge on the increases. You have a better chance of negotiating those increases with an independent landlord with a property that landlord owns outright, instead of dealing with these large property management companies that have to streamline all of their expenses, right? Does that make sense? So let's say that the base rent is $5,000 a month, which is $60,000 a year. The following year, if there was a 3% increase, that $5,000 rent goes up by $150. And it's consecutive. Every year, 5150, 5230, and so on and so forth. So by year 5, you have to look at whether your tenant is going to be priced out of their budget or not. Is their business going to grow enough to be able to cover those increases over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? That's a very important piece to understand about your client's budget and ability to pay, right? Payability on the rent. Any questions on that?
I just have a question.
Yep.
So I know that the rent can increase, like you said, 2 to 3, maybe up to 4%, depending on the situation. And then with the CAM increase, does it, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, are we to assume that because the rent goes up by 3%, that the CAM is going to go up a percentage too, or is that stated completely that CAM will increase by X amount and rent will increase by X amount?
That's a great question. And no, they are two separate increases. Okay. When you look at a lease, the CAM is going to be bundled under what's called additional rent. Okay. And the verbiage on that lease is going to tell you how the landlord plans on doing those increases. The triple net, or the net, which is taxes and insurance, that's at cost, right? Taxes are going to increase. That's out of the landlord's control. And the insurance premiums will increase accordingly. And that's just basically what needs to be reimbursed. But that triple net, that third net, the CAM, that's what you need to look out for, right? Because you're going to have, let's say, 3 or 4% increases on the base rent. But
Mhm.
then the landlord could try to make up for some lost revenue and say, well, the CAM is increasing 5% this year.
Okay.
Ask for an
Good.
itemized list. What increased? Why
Mhm.
did it increase to 5%?
And
The
we'll look
landlord,
for
the
that
tenant has
under,
the right to ask for that information.
and we'll look for that under the verbiage like additional rent. Okay.
Correct.
Thank
Hmm. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Okay. So let's look at some critical lease terms and clauses. I would take notes on these things. These are very important points that I'm going to be talking about. So let's look at lease terms and renewals. The shorter your lease term, the higher the rent is going to be, or the closer to asking that the rent is going to be, but you're going to have more flexibility on other terms. Okay. I'll give you an example. I've had clients that have gone in at asking because there was just a lot of demand for that space, so they didn't want to lose it. But we were able to negotiate a cap on the annual increases on the first 2 years. We capped the annual increase at 2% as opposed to 3%, so that basically it could balance out their projected budget over the next 3 to 5 years. So when you have a shorter term, the landlord is getting more money. So upfront, so the first 2 years, very negotiable on those types of caps. Um, the longer the term, the more you have to negotiate other terms, right? Because you're showing more of a commitment that you're going to stay there and you're not going to leave after 2 to 3 years. So you can negotiate that base rent a lot easier if you're going to be signing 5 or 10 year terms. Um, now, the the bottom line on a long term lease is um, they're going to want to see a lot more strength financially, right? So your client needs to be able to come strong with financials if they're going to want to sign a longer lease. But again, that strong financial positioning is what's going to give them the flexibility to really negotiate a lot of those base lease terms. There's been a lot of assignment and sublease activity going on in the market. What that means is, and I'll give you an example with one of my listings, is there's a space that can be utilized for an automotive use, and we have a tenant that's coming into the place that's going to put in a car wash. But one of the contingencies they wanted was there's a garage that's right in the middle that they won't be using, and they wanted to be able to sublease that space to maybe a tinting company or a detail company or a tire company. So they wanted to be able to have that flexibility. Now, if you are working with the tenant and the tenant wants to sublease a space, sublease an office within their office, you need to be able to get that permission, because if you do it without the landlord's consent, that could be a breach of your contract. But when you're asking for that permission and they give you the permission, you need to make sure that within the lease, there is that term, not unreasonably withheld. What does that mean? That means that the landlord just can't say, no, you can't do it just because it felt like he didn't want to do it. He needs to have a valid reason not to allow you to sublease the specific tenant when you bring them in. So if that tenant that you're bringing in, it makes sense that they're in that office. Let's say you have a real estate office and you want to sublease an office to a title company or to a lender, that makes sense. There is no reason, or it's not unreasonable for the tenant to say, for the landlord to say yes, right? Because it makes sense that they're going to be there. It supplements the business. They help each other out. So yeah, why wouldn't I let you sublease it? Now, if you wanted to have a real estate office and then you wanted to have, I don't know, a 3D printing manufacturer, or someone that uses chemicals inside of an office space, it's just that's not reasonable, right? So the landlord would have a reason to say that doesn't make sense to me. So I'm not going to allow it. But that statement right there, not unreasonably withheld, is very important for you to be able to have the flexibility to sublease to the right people so that you can supplement your business model, however you want to do. Any questions on assignability?
Uh,
Go
so
ahead.
I understand it completely. The question I have, though, in that signability, does the landlord have a right to negotiate a percentage of what the sublease the person is getting, or because they're leasing the entire space and then they have
Yes.
the agreement for sublease, it takes the landlord out of receiving any profits off of the sublease.
Yes, you will see it. Do you see it often? Not so much. Okay. What I have seen is that the rent increases a little bit for the tenant just so that they can have that assignability option.
Okay.
Okay. And that's what I did representing the landlord. We were leasing out for 2,500. He said, well, if he's going to sublease, the rent's going to be 3,000 because he's going to be supplemented more than that.
Hmm.
$500, right? If he
Yes.
subleases it to somebody else. So it's
Okay.
kind of a give and take. Everything is negotiable. Yes, the landlord can ask for a percentage. Yes, in a sublease, if it's sales, the landlord might ask for a percentage of the sales of the sublease. So anything's really possible. It just depends on who the landlord is, and that's what makes commercial so dynamic and so
Mhm.
sporadic, I guess, and unpredictable because you just don't know who the owner is, right? It could be somebody that wants to be an opportunist and wants to just take advantage of it. Or it could be a nice guy that says, I don't care if you sublease, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
You know,
Cool.
but you got to know who you're dealing with for sure. And that's very important.
Good. Thanks.
Mhm. Tenant improvements, negotiate who pays for the modifications. This is something that I've been seeing less and less of, but when you're dealing with newer build outs, you do tend to see a lot more tenant improvement allowance. And what is the tenant improvement allowance? That's basically the landlord saying, I know that there needs to be work done here, and so I'm willing to reimburse some or all of the cost of the tenant improvements in order for the tenant that's coming in to build out whatever it is that they want to build out. The more value add that the tenant is going to give this space, the more open the landlord is going to be for reimbursements. And I'll explain that. Let's say that you have an office that you wanted to just tear down the kitchenette completely and you wanted to cover that up and convert it into a bathroom. For the landlord, that might not seem like it's adding value. That might actually be taking value out of the space because you want a kitchenette in an office. You want to be able to have a break room for your employees in an office. So when you're taking that out, that's not actual value add, right? So value add would be it's an open space. I mean, it's just like a very open space, but you're in an office complex. And the tenant is going to come in and build out offices and conference rooms and really just update the floor plan of this space for the landlord. So the landlord might say, yeah, that makes sense. And that actually would add value to my space. Once they leave, I can lease it out as an office space and there's no build out. It's turnkey. That makes things easier for me. So I'm going to be more willing to give you tenant improvement to be able to do that so that we can share the cost on making this build out. It works for the tenant because the tenant does not pay for the full cost of the build out. And it works for the landlord because long term, when that tenant leaves, the build out remains. So it's actually an incentive for the landlord to say, I'll give you a reimbursement. Now, how much is being reimbursed depends on the landlord, depends on the property management company. Right now, we're negotiating a complete build out on an office space, flooring, lighting, new cabinets in the kitchenette, side lighting for all the doors in the offices in the space. And the property management company is very open to provide that because they're modernizing the office space. And obviously that stays in the unit once this tenant decides to move out. So right now, what the landlord is doing or the property management company is doing is they're pricing out what it's going to cost. And then they're going to come back to me this week and they're going to say, this is what the total cost of everything that you asked us that you wanted in this space is going to cost. We're willing to give you X amount to reimburse you for these costs. Then the tenant needs to decide, is that good enough? Do we have that kind of money to complete the build out? A lot of times they need to have the money to complete the full build out and then they get reimbursed. And sometimes the landlord says, we can handle the flooring, we can handle the doors and the cabinets, but you would have to do this, this, and this, and we can reimburse you X amount. All that to say is that it's very negotiable, but if you know how to position it right and position it in a way that's going to add value for the landlord long term, you're probably going to be able to get a lot more tenant improvement allowance than if you just said, well, we want, marble cabinetry and we want this and that. It just doesn't work that way sometimes. You have to be very strategic on how you position what you want and how it's going to add value to the space. Any questions on that?
Yes. So the property management or landlord agree to reimbursement for part of the build out and advancement of the building, but whose contractor is being used?
That's a good question. Sometimes the property management has in-house contractors that will do the build out, which is in this case, the scenario that I gave you for the office space, they have in-house contractors, which is why I know they're going to be able to do the flooring and the updated cabinetry in the kitchenette, and the painting of the walls. And so that for them, they can handle it. They got their people to do it. They will price it out and they will include that in the tenant improvement that they're providing for the tenant. Everything else, like the side lighting for the doors, like the black tiled ceilings and the recessed lighting, they're not going to touch that. They're going to say, you need to do that. You need to find a contractor to do that. We priced it out for you, but you're more than welcome to price it out on your own. And then come back to us and tell us, what it costs to see if we can negotiate the reimbursement.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay. And how do the reimbursements work? It works different types of ways, but typically when they're offering a tenant improvement reimbursement, they're going to say it's, let's say it's a 2,000 square foot facility and they want to offer $15 a square foot. They're going to offer you $30,000 in tenant improvements, which would come out as a draw. So you do the doors, the side lighting for the doors that came out for $7,000 or $8,000. Provide those receipts to the landlord. They cut you a check for the $8,000. You have $22,000 remaining. Okay. So that's usually how the tenant improvement allowance or reimbursement works. And sometimes they'll say, okay, we'll work on it together because we have a contractor, right? So it depends on the situation. That's something that's very important. Ask those questions, find out how they would provide the tenant improvement because that's how you're going to be able to plan out your build out properly. Okay. Exclusive use. Very important if you have a coffee shop, if you have a restaurant, if you have a very specific type of service, taxes, insurance, real estate. When you're going into a location, you want to be able to protect your tenant from direct competition. What good is it if you are a real estate service and then they put another real estate office right next to you and then another one right next to you? Then you have all this competition and it kind of just, brings down your potential acquisition of new clients that are walking by and looking for a real estate agent, right? So you want to make sure that you protect your agents or your tenants by defining the business scope very precisely. What services are you offering? What products are you offering? Because sometimes coffee shops will have baked goods. Are you a bakery or are you a coffee shop? And where are the exclusions that are going to help benefit or push your business forward by minimizing the competition? So you want to be able to include radius restrictions when possible. This is something that Starbucks does very well. Dunkin' Donuts does this very well. Yes, I can email the slides. This is something that a lot of restaurants will do. So aside from asking if there are any inclusions or exclusions when you're working with a tenant, you also want to be able to negotiate these exclusions with the landlord so that no new competitors can come into this space and be a direct competition for you. Okay. Any questions on the exclusive use? I'm sure a lot of you have ran into that, right? Oh, we already have a tax office. We can't put a tax office in here. Or we already have a coffee shop. We can't put another coffee shop in here. I'm sure you guys have ran into that, right? Okay, moving on. Default and termination clauses. Define default clearly. I have seen landlords, and by default, there's a clause in the lease where if the tenant defaults, they have X amount of days to resolve the default before they start doing the proceedings of getting evicted or taking liens on the property or the equipment. And sometimes landlords try to get very quick with it and say, you have 5 days to fix your default. You have 3 days to fix your default. And that's not enough time to allow your tenant to fix the default to be able to get current and be able to continue on with the lease. So you got to be very clear that you want to specify exactly what constitutes a default. What is a default? You got to be very clear with that, no vague verbiage. And you want to negotiate cure periods of at least 10 days for non-monetary issues. Okay, 10 days for non-monetary issues and 30 days for monetary issues. Okay, this protects your tenant. If they fall behind for whatever issue, they had an emergency, somebody, their family members in the hospital had an accident, whatever, you can't expect them to cure a financial default in 5 days. So you want to protect your tenant by doing 30 days for monetary defaults, 10 days for non-monetary defaults. What is a non-monetary default? They haven't maintained the front part of the property the way they're supposed to. They're getting complaints. They need to clean up. They need to fix the shrubbery. They need to clean the grease trap in the back is overflowing. You need to fix that. The garbage isn't being taken out properly. You need to clean out the garbage in the dumpster. Those are non-monetary defaults. Monetary defaults, I'm late on my rent. I'm falling behind. I had an emergency. I need 30 days to fix this default. Early termination. Include a buyout provision. Consider business contraction, expansion needs. This one, it's tough. This one's a touchy one because every tenant is going to want to get some sort of early termination clause in their contract in case business doesn't do well. In this market, it's very difficult because we already went through a very rough market where a lot of the tenants defaulted and left. Okay, so now landlords are bitter. Now landlords have money that they need to recover. Landlords are being very picky about who and what goes into their spaces, and they want to make sure that they stay there and there's no early termination. Early termination clauses for a landlord probably equals a red flag that they're not going to be able to pay the rent. So you got to be very cautious of how you provide that clause for early termination. And it doesn't need to be, oh, if business doesn't work, we can walk away and we're good. No, if business doesn't work, you can do what's called a good guy guarantee. A good guy guarantee basically means if the business, for whatever reason, does not work, then the tenant has to assume 12 months worth of rent, right? But it can be paid over the course of a few months as long as you provide early enough notification that you're going to need to exit. So it's negotiable. It could be 6 months. It could be 3 months worth of rent. If for whatever reason the business isn't working, we will pay 3 months worth of rent and we will help secure a sublease for the location. So there's different ways to position an early termination clause in the lease without making it seem like, man, they're just going to walk away if the rent isn't being paid. But you always want to try at least to create that contingency or that clause. I was able to negotiate 1 year for PPEC that I worked with because they needed to be able to get their license in place, get it approved, and be operational. And so we were able to work a year's worth of early termination. Of course, I put my commission on the line for that just to make it work. But again, everything's negotiable on how you present it, but that is very important depending on the type of business that they need a little bit of ramp up time just to be able to see if it's going to hit or not. It's very important to have that. Landlord remedies limit landlord's ability to accelerate rent, require mitigation of damages. So, in a case of a listing that I have, my landlord wants to be able to put a lien on any equipment that is being installed into the location in case there needs to be any remedies. And he wanted to accelerate the rent by 24 months in case there was any type of default. I had to advise him that it was a bit aggressive based off of the amount of money that was being injected into the location. But again, representing the tenant, you have to look out for those things and be able to say, that's too much. Like, you cannot accelerate the rent. What does that mean? It means if you default or there's a breach of contract, the landlord can say, you owe me 24 months worth of rent right now, or I'm taking you to court. So you want to be able to limit those things that the landlord wants to do to remedy or recover fund monies or whatever it is. You got to be very careful on how you're mitigating those damages, and especially if you're representing the tenant, right? And reciprocal default. Ensure that the landlord default remedies exist. Sometimes the lease is strictly landlord friendly. A lot of times the lease is landlord friendly, especially if the lease was written up by his attorney friend that knows exactly what to put on there so that the landlord has zero obligations and zero responsibilities to abide by any type of requirements or remedies that the landlord might default on, right? Let's say the landlord is charging you a common area maintenance for landscaping and lighting and cleanup of the parking lot, and he's not doing any of that. And the parking lot is becoming dirty, it's not maintained, the pavement is cracking, the bushes are all out of whack, the lighting doesn't even work at night, so everyone's afraid to come to your plaza because there's no lights in the plaza. Those are things that the landlord is responsible for. What if on the lease it says that the landlord is responsible to repair any damages to the HVAC systems and your AC breaks down and he's telling you you have to pay for it? Okay, so you need to make sure that there are defaults or remedies that exist that actually go back onto the landlord, because the lease has to be friendly for both the landlord and the tenant. It cannot just be one-sided, okay? And especially if you're representing the tenant, you got to make sure you protect your tenant by making sure that those remedies are in place on the lease. Any questions?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So in this scenarios with the lease, is the lease being presented to us from the landlord or listing, and we're reading the lease, and anything that we find in the lease that is not going to be of a benefit or that could be negotiable for our tenant, then we're responding with adding all of these or whatever applicable things into the lease? Or are we
I'm
writing the
going to get
lease?
to that because
Okay.
there's a fine line, right?
Okay.
Because a lease is a legal document. And so, although you can look out for these things, it is always recommended to have an attorney review and respond with the red lines.
Okay.
Okay. Do not respond to the red lines on a lease because that is a legal document. And if you do that, it would be considered giving legal advice.
Okay.
Always recommend the tenant to sit down with an attorney and review the lease and lease terms, but doesn't mean that you can't look out for it when you're discussing the letter of intent, right? When you're
Yeah.
looking at the terms and the conditions that are being discussed prior to the lease being written up. The lease being written up is really that final step where they're writing up the contract, you finalize all the terms, and these red flags might come up that you had not discussed prior, right? So you got to make sure you discuss these things prior to going to lease to make sure that everyone's on the same page when it comes to remedies, when it comes to capping the increases, when it comes to the percentages. All those things need to be discussed prior to going to a lease. But sometimes you just go to lease and you don't have time to respond to it. You can review the lease and look at the red flags, but always, always, always have an attorney review that lease with your client because that is legal advice and it comes better being redlined from an attorney than if you did it, because then you're putting yourself in a legal situation.
Legal situation.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
So in order to have leverage on negotiations, what is the optimal outcome? Like I said, the lease has to be friendly for the tenant and it has to be friendly for the landlord. It needs to be good for both parties to be able to have a good synergy moving forward, to have a good relationship. If things come up, there's things in the lease that are going to remedy both sides, right? So the optimal outcome would be a win-win agreement with future flexibility so that both parties feel comfortable going into this new agreement, whether it's 3, 5, or 10 years. A lot of what's going to give you leverage is the market research. If they're trying to charge you $30 a square foot, but the two buildings next to you are leasing out for 20, 25, that immediately gives you leverage to leverage the price point or the base rent. Um, Again, like I mentioned to you just now, Roz, professional support. It's always good to have an attorney at hand. Sometimes your clients will have their own attorneys that can review these things for you. Other times we can get an attorney to, for a small charge, review the lease with the client and be able to redline any items that they're not comfortable with. And what an attorney will do is they will go line by line and explain every piece of the lease to the tenant so that they feel comfortable, right? Same way that you review a HUD with a buyer right before closing. You want to make sure they're comfortable with the numbers. It's the same thing that you want to do when you finally get that lease. Before you sign, you want to have that attorney review those terms with your client so that your client is comfortable with the terms, the numbers, the percentages before they sign. Peter.
And is that the service that RJ and AJ, what is it, provide?
I don't know if they provide that service, but I do have an attorney that can provide that service.
Okay,
And
excellent.
I will share that with you guys.
Okay, thanks.
Peter.
That was my question. If we had a negotiated rate with JK Closings to
Not with JK, but we do have Palacios that has done that for us in the past at a good price.
Okay.
And the one thing that you can do with Palacio is, look, these are the things that are kind of red flags for me. I'm not an attorney, but they kind of stood out. Could you make sure that you go over those points with the client and just redline them for us? Yep. Okay. And communication, clear articulation of your business needs, right? If you're asking for something, why do you need it? It's not just because you want a pretty marble countertops in the kitchenette. You want to be able to validate what you're asking for as far as the build out is concerned. You're building out a coffee shop, you're building out a restaurant. You need a larger hood range. The 10-foot is not enough because this is a 3,000, 4,000 square foot restaurant that's going to hold 100 and 120 potential clients at one point. You need a larger hood. I mean, you need to be able to articulate exactly what your business needs are in order to be able to have more leverage for your negotiation. And as always get legal review before signing. Any small clause can have a major financial impact for your tenant. So it's very important that you have legal advice before you sign. And you are not an attorney. You cannot provide legal advice on a legal document. You can provide advice and pointers on a letter of intent. This is why a letter of intent is so important before going into contract, because it gives you the ability to leverage and negotiate a lot of the terms before they go into a legally binding document. So always understand that the process that you take with your tenant is really going to determine the outcome once they go to sign the lease. So understand the LOI gives you the ability to set the standard and set the points that you want to make sure are there to protect your tenant. And then when the lease comes out, just have the attorney make sure that those points are there and they're correct before your tenant signs. Any questions?
I have a question in regards to commission. Do
Yes.
we ask about that prior to showing, or how does that work?
100% you asked about it. Yes.
Okay.
That is literally one of the first things that I ask when I talk to anybody is what is your co-op? What are you offering as a co-broke commission?
Okay.
Okay. And when they tell me and I respond via email so that it's documented.
Okay, perfect. And then do we have to, or is it best practice to get like I know it's not for commercial, it's mostly residential, but should we get a document signed for an agreement with our prospective tenants?
I recommend it.
Okay.
So typically in commercial, it's not a requirement, right? Disclosures are required for residential. They're not required for commercial. However, depending on who your client is, and even if you know them very well, they might still try to circumvent or try to go around you to go talk to the tenant, to the landlord, because they think they can get an answer quicker than you. You never know, and that could ruin your potential of getting paid a commission. So if you feel you can get an exclusive broker agreement with them, do it.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Of course. All right, and then I have a goodie for you guys, for those that joined the call today. One of the biggest issues that you're going to run into in commercial leases, and we'll wrap up real quick, we have a couple of minutes, is my use allowed in this zoning district? Okay. And a lot of times you have to call the county and you have to leave 1,000 messages before they call you back or before they actually answer the call. But I have a little gift for you, and it is the Muni Code allowable use table. And And this is for Orange County, but I want you to know that it exists for most counties, okay? And what this table is it gives you the use, dog groomers, restaurants, tobacco, cigar shop, whatever it is, and it gives you all the zonings where it's allowable or it's allowed with restrictions. And if you don't like going to if you don't like going to a website and searching through all those things, I actually have it downloaded as a Word document so that you can literally, I can't send a Word document. I'll send it in the group chat. Okay. So the Word document, you literally open it up and just Control F and then type in grooming, and it'll take you right to grooming and you'll be able to see the zonings where it's allowed. So this is a really cool, good tool to have when you're working with tenants or buyers, even when they're looking to get into a specific area and they have a very specific business. You want to know what zoning is allowed for that business so that it can make your search a lot easier. Okay. All right, that will conclude the training for today, guys. Thank you so much for showing up. As usual, I will post the recording in the group chat and I will post it on school. If you have not joined the school network, please do. I'm going to add a lot of good stuff on there that is not part of our Monday trainings. So please join the community. If you have any questions, I'll be available today.
Thank you, Mauricio. It was great.
Thank you so
you.
much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Have a
Alrighty.
good day, everybody.
Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye. Bye.